In a small, quiet town where nothing exciting ever seemed to happen, the local courthouse buzzed with unusual energy one crisp Monday morning. The air was thick with murmurs as people filtered into the courtroom, curious about the day's proceedings. At the center of all the attention stood Ethan Carter, a 17-year-old boy who looked more like he belonged in a skate park than in front of a judge. With his slightly oversized hoodie, scuffed sneakers, and messy hair, Ethan didn't exactly scream law-abiding citizen. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. He wasn't used to being the focus of so many stares. Ethan had been accused of vandalizing City Hall, a serious offense that had stirred up quite a bit of controversy in the otherwise sleepy town. Someone had spray-painted bold, colorful graffiti across the side of the building, and the words "Change Now" were splashed in large letters for everyone to see. While some saw it as an act of rebellion or protest, others viewed it as pure vandalism. Either way, it was clear this wasn't just a simple case of teenage mischief. It had become a hot topic of debate among residents. The judge presiding over the case was none other than Margaret Hensley, a no-nonsense woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper gaze. She adjusted her glasses as she glanced down at the young man standing before her. Her expression was unreadable, but her tone made her feelings perfectly clear. "Another delinquent wasting my time," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for the bailiff nearby to hear. It wasn't uncommon for teenagers to end up in her courtroom, and she often treated them with the same mix of frustration and disdain. To her, Ethan was just another statistic, a kid who thought he could get away with breaking the rules. Things only got worse when it became apparent that Ethan's public defender hadn't shown up. Apparently, the lawyer was stuck in traffic and running late. The court clerk suggested postponing the hearing until the attorney arrived, but Ethan shook his head firmly. "I can handle this myself," he said, surprising everyone in the room. His voice wavered slightly, but there was a determination in his eyes that caught a few people off guard. Judge Hensley raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "You?" she asked, her tone dripping with disbelief. "Do you even know what you're doing?" The crowd exchanged amused glances, and a few chuckles rippled through the gallery. Even the prosecutor smirked, leaning back in his chair as if he already knew how this would play out. Ethan's decision to represent himself seemed laughable to most people, especially given his age and appearance. But beneath his calm exterior, Ethan's mind raced. He knew the odds weren't in his favor. Without legal representation, he'd have to rely entirely on his own knowledge and instincts to defend himself. And while he might have looked like an ordinary teenager on the outside, inside, he harbored a secret that could change everything. For him, for the case, and perhaps even for the judge who had already written him off. As the trial began, Judge Hensley continued to make snide remarks, rolling her eyes whenever Ethan stumbled over legal terms or hesitated during his opening statement. Yet, despite her mockery and the weight of the situation, Ethan refused to back down. Deep down, he believed in his innocence, and he was determined to prove it, no matter what it took. Little did anyone in that courtroom know they were about to witness something extraordinary from the unassuming teenager standing before them. The courtroom was eerily quiet as Ethan began to speak, his voice steady but tinged with nervousness. He cleared his throat and started explaining his side of the story, trying his best to sound confident. But almost immediately, Judge Hensley interrupted him. "Do you even know what mens rea means?" she asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Ethan paused for a moment, his brow furrowing as he processed the question. Before he could answer, the judge leaned forward in her chair, her expression smug. "That's Latin for guilty mind," she explained mockingly, as if speaking to a child. "It's a basic concept in criminal law. Surely, someone representing themselves would know that." A few people in the gallery chuckled softly, and Ethan felt his cheeks grow warm. He clenched his fists under the table, forcing himself to stay composed. He had expected skepticism, but this level of mockery was something else entirely. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a neatly pressed suit and an air of superiority, smirked openly. He exchanged a glance with the judge, clearly enjoying the spectacle unfolding before him. To them, Ethan was just another reckless teenager biting off more than he could chew. But Ethan wasn't about to let their condescension break him. He took a deep breath and looked directly at the judge. "Yes, Your Honor," he said calmly, meeting her gaze. "Mens rea refers to the mental state or intent behind committing a crime. Without it, there can be no conviction." His response caught the room off guard. For a split second, Judge Hensley's smug expression faltered, though she quickly masked it with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Memorized definitions won't save you here," she retorted sharply. "Let's see if you can actually apply them." As the trial continued, the judge grew increasingly impatient with Ethan's casual demeanor. When he stumbled over legal terminology while presenting his opening statement, she didn't hesitate to pounce. "Are you sure you're not wasting everyone's time?" she asked, her voice laced with disdain. Each comment drew more stifled laughter from the audience, but Ethan refused to let it rattle him. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, carefully piecing together his defense. At one point, the prosecutor attempted to introduce evidence without much explanation, assuming Ethan wouldn't challenge it. But Ethan surprised him by objecting, citing procedural errors in how the evidence was being presented. The prosecutor blinked in confusion, taken aback by the teenager's unexpected knowledge. Judge Hensley sighed audibly, clearly irritated. "This isn't a game, young man," she snapped. "If you're going to object, you'd better have a valid reason." Ethan nodded respectfully, then proceeded to explain his reasoning with surprising clarity. He referenced specific sections of the law, pointing out why the evidence shouldn't be admitted until proper procedures were followed. The prosecutor frowned, glancing through his notes as if searching for a rebuttal. Even the bailiff, who had been leaning casually against the wall, straightened up slightly, intrigued by the exchange. Despite the mounting tension, Ethan remained calm, his confidence growing with each passing moment. He knew he was up against powerful opponents who underestimated him because of his age and appearance. But instead of letting their ridicule discourage him, he used it to fuel his determination. Every snide remark from the judge only strengthened his resolve to prove them wrong. By the time the morning session ended, whispers filled the courtroom. People who had come expecting a quick and predictable outcome now found themselves wondering if they had misjudged the young defendant. Was Ethan really as clueless as he seemed, or was there more to him than met the eye? As the crowd filed out for a lunch break, the prosecutor lingered behind, muttering to himself. Judge Hensley, meanwhile, sat silently at her bench, staring at the case file in front of her. Something about Ethan's composure unsettled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. When the court reconvened after the break, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. The mockery hadn't disappeared entirely, but there was a new undertone of curiosity, and perhaps even a hint of respect, creeping into the proceedings. Ethan may have been mocked and underestimated, but he was far from defeated. And as the trial moved forward, it became clear that he wasn't just fighting to prove his innocence. He was also determined to show the world that appearances could be deceiving. As the trial moved into its next phase, the prosecution called their first witness, a middle-aged man named Mr. Peterson, who claimed to have seen Ethan near City Hall on the night of the vandalism. The prosecutor guided him through his testimony, painting a vivid picture for the courtroom. "I was taking a late-night walk," Mr. Peterson began, his voice steady. "And I saw this young man, hoodie pulled up, walking suspiciously close to City Hall. It was definitely him." Ethan listened carefully, his expression neutral but his mind racing. When it was his turn to cross-examine the witness, he stood slowly, his movements deliberate. Judge Hensley raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical of what she assumed would be another clumsy attempt by the teenager to defend himself. But Ethan surprised everyone with his first question. "You said you recognized me by my hoodie. Can you describe anything else about my appearance that night?" Mr. Peterson hesitated, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, you were wearing dark jeans and sneakers," he stammered. "And your hood was up, like I said." Ethan nodded thoughtfully before pressing further. Did you see my face, or any other distinct features that could confirm it was me? The witness squirmed under Ethan's calm, but pointed questioning. After a long pause, he admitted, "No, I didn't see your face, just your clothes." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as people began to realize the flaw in the prosecution's argument. Ethan seized the moment, turning to address the judge. "Your Honor, eyewitness identification based solely on clothing is notoriously unreliable. Studies have shown that memory can be easily influenced, especially when someone is viewed briefly or from a distance." He spoke with authority, citing examples of cases where mistaken identity led to wrongful convictions. The prosecutor tried to intervene, objecting to Ethan's line of questioning, but Ethan countered smoothly, referencing specific legal precedents that supported his argument. Even Judge Hensley looked taken aback by his knowledge. For the first time, her usual air of superiority wavered. She glanced down at the case file, her brow furrowing slightly as she considered Ethan's points. Next, Ethan requested access to the surveillance footage from City Hall, arguing that it might provide definitive proof of his innocence or guilt. At first, the prosecutor resisted, claiming the footage wasn't relevant. But Ethan pushed back, pointing out that if the prosecution truly believed he was guilty, they should have nothing to hide. Reluctantly, the judge ordered the footage to be produced. When the video finally played on a small screen set up in the courtroom, gasps echoed through the room. The grainy footage showed a figure in a hoodie standing near City Hall, but there was something off. The person on screen appeared taller than Ethan and walked with a noticeable limp. Ethan stepped forward, addressing the court. "Your Honor, I'm 5'8", and I don't have a limp. This isn't me." The prosecutor scrambled to explain, suggesting the video quality made accurate identification difficult. But Ethan wasn't finished yet. He calmly presented medical records showing he had never suffered an injury that would cause him to walk with a limp. The prosecutor's confidence began to crack, and even Judge Hensley leaned forward, her earlier mockery replaced by intrigue. By now, the courtroom was buzzing with whispered conversations. People exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief while others nodded approvingly at Ethan's sharp reasoning. The bailiff muttered to a colleague, "This kid's smarter than half the lawyers I've seen in here." Even the gallery spectators, who had initially come expecting a routine hearing, found themselves captivated. They watched as Ethan dismantled each piece of the prosecution's case with precision and poise. What started as a seemingly open and shut trial was rapidly turning into something far more complex and fascinating. For Judge Hensley, the shift was undeniable. Her earlier dismissiveness had given way to cautious curiosity. She couldn't help but wonder how a teenager possessed such a deep understanding of legal procedures and strategies. As the day wore on, one thing became clear. Ethan wasn't just defending himself. He was proving that intelligence and determination could overcome even the harshest biases. And as the trial progressed, the once skeptical courtroom began to see him not as a reckless teen, but as a formidable opponent who refused to back down without a fight. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the grainy surveillance footage played again, this time with Ethan standing beside the screen, pointing out key details. "Notice the height difference," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This person is at least 6 feet tall, significantly taller than me." He paused to let the audience absorb the information before continuing, "And look closely at how they're walking. That limp is unmistakable. It's consistent throughout the video." Ethan then turned to face the judge and jury, his expression earnest. "Your Honor, I've brought medical records that confirm I don't have any condition or injury that would cause me to walk like that. In fact, my doctor has noted in these records that I've always had a normal gait." He handed over the documents, which were passed along to Judge Hensley for review. The prosecutor objected immediately, claiming the records weren't relevant, but Ethan countered by explaining how they directly contradicted the prosecution's claim that he was the person in the video. Judge Hensley studied the documents carefully, her earlier skepticism softening into genuine interest. She glanced between the screen and Ethan, clearly weighing the evidence. For the first time since the trial began, she didn't interrupt or mock him. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the bench as if deep in thought. Even the prosecutor seemed flustered, fumbling through his notes in search of a rebuttal. Sensing an opportunity, Ethan pressed further. If we're relying on visual evidence, then we need to consider all of it, not just what fits one side's narrative, he said, addressing the jury. The hoodie might look similar to mine, but clothing isn't unique. Thousands of people own hoodies like this. Without seeing the face, or even having clearer footage, we can't definitively say who this person is. To drive his point home, Ethan introduced another piece of evidence, photos from his phone showing him miles away from City Hall on the night of the vandalism. The timestamps matched up perfectly with the timeline provided by the prosecution. He explained that he had been at a coffee shop working on a school project, something several witnesses could verify. One of those witnesses, a barista named Sarah, took the stand later and confirmed Ethan's alibi without hesitation. As the pieces fell into place, murmurs spread through the courtroom. People whispered to each other, shaking their heads in disbelief. A teenage boy, someone everyone had dismissed as clueless and reckless, was systematically dismantling the prosecution's case. The prosecutor grew increasingly agitated, his objections becoming more frequent and desperate. But each objection only highlighted how weak his arguments were becoming. Even Judge Hensley couldn't ignore the mounting inconsistencies. At one point, she interrupted the proceedings to ask Ethan a direct question. "How do you know so much about presenting evidence and challenging testimony?" Her tone wasn't mocking this time. It was curious, almost admiring. Ethan hesitated for a moment, glancing around the room before answering. "I've spent years studying law, Your Honor," he admitted quietly. "Not because I wanted to be here today, but because I believe in justice, and in making sure no one gets wrongly accused." His words hung in the air, resonating deeply with everyone present. The gallery spectators exchanged astonished looks, some nodding approvingly, while others whispered about how remarkable Ethan's composure and knowledge were. Even the bailiff, who had initially rolled his eyes at the teenager, now watched him with a newfound respect. By the end of the day, the momentum of the trial had shifted dramatically. What started as a mockery of a teenager trying to defend himself had transformed into a compelling display of logic, preparation, and determination. Ethan wasn't just proving his innocence. He was exposing flaws in the system itself, showing how easily assumptions and biases could lead to wrongful accusations. As the session adjourned, Judge Hensley announced that closing arguments would take place the next morning. But as she banged her gavel to signal the end of the day, it was clear to everyone in the room. Ethan Carter was no ordinary defendant. And whatever happened next, he had already earned the respect of many who had doubted him. The next morning, the courtroom was packed with even more spectators than before. Word had spread about the surprising turn of events, and people were eager to see how the trial would unfold. Reporters scribbled notes furiously in their notepads. Cameras clicked softly from the back of the room, and whispered conversations buzzed like static in the air. Everyone wanted answers, and they weren't just curious about whether Ethan was guilty or innocent anymore. They wanted to know how a teenager could outsmart seasoned professionals. When Judge Hensley called the court to order, there was an unspoken tension hanging over the proceedings. The prosecutor looked restless, flipping through his files as if searching for something he might have missed. Ethan, on the other hand, stood calmly at the defendant's table, his hands resting lightly on the edge. He didn't seem nervous. Instead, he radiated quiet confidence, as though he'd known all along that the truth would eventually come to light. Before closing arguments began, Ethan requested to call one final witness, a forensic analyst named Dr. Emily Grayson. She was a respected expert in her field, known for her meticulous work analyzing evidence in high-profile cases. As she took the stand, the atmosphere shifted. This wasn't just another witness. It was someone whose word carried weight, someone who could sway opinions with hard facts. Dr. Grayson explained that she had examined the paint used in the graffiti on City Hall and compared it to samples taken from Ethan's belongings. Her findings were clear. The paint matched materials found at a local art studio. Not anything Ethan owned. Based on my analysis, she said firmly, there is no connection between the defendant and the vandalism. The prosecutor tried to challenge her testimony, questioning her methods and suggesting alternative explanations. But Dr. Grayson remained unfazed, countering each objection with precise, technical details that left little room for doubt. By the time she stepped down from the stand, the prosecution's case felt weaker than ever. As the trial moved into closing arguments, Ethan rose to address the court. His voice was steady, his words measured, but there was an undeniable passion behind what he said. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, looking directly at them. "This case isn't just about me. It's about fairness. It's about ensuring that accusations are backed by solid evidence, not assumptions or stereotypes." He went on to summarize the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case: the unreliable eyewitness testimony, the surveillance footage showing someone who didn't match his description, the forensic analysis disproving any link between him and the crime. Each point landed like a hammer strike, driving home the overwhelming lack of proof against him. Then, almost casually, he dropped the bombshell everyone had been waiting for. "I've studied law since I was 14 years old," he admitted, his tone softening slightly. "I passed the bar exam unofficially because I wanted to help people who couldn't afford expensive lawyers. I've worked pro bono on dozens of cases, often disguised as a friend or family member so I wouldn't draw attention. I never meant to end up here today, defending myself, but now that I am, I hope you can see why I care so much about justice." The room fell silent. For a moment, no one spoke. Even Judge Hensley seemed stunned, her pen hovering midair above her notepad. The prosecutor sank into his chair, visibly deflated, while members of the gallery exchanged astonished glances. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others nodded approvingly, and a few even clapped quietly before realizing where they were. Ethan's revelation wasn't just shocking, it was inspiring. Here was a young man who had dedicated his life to helping others, despite facing barriers most adults couldn't imagine. And yet, he had done it all without seeking recognition or reward. His humility struck a chord with everyone present, including Judge Hensley, who finally broke the silence. "Mr. Carter," she said slowly, her voice tinged with both admiration and regret, "you've proven yourself today, not only as a defendant, but as someone who understands the principles of justice better than many professionals I've encountered." Her earlier mockery was gone, replaced by genuine respect. "You've given us all something to think about." As Ethan returned to his seat, the courtroom erupted into murmurs once again. People whispered about the boy genius, the self-taught attorney, the teenager who had turned a simple vandalism case into a lesson on integrity and perseverance. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain: Ethan Carter had already won far more than just his freedom. He had earned the trust and admiration of everyone lucky enough to witness his extraordinary journey. The courtroom was electric as the jury filed back in after their deliberation. The foreman stood up, holding a slip of paper that felt heavier than it looked. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of anticipation, "we find the defendant, Ethan Carter, not guilty on all counts." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, like a dam breaking, the gallery erupted into applause and murmurs of disbelief. People clapped, some even cheered, while others simply stared at Ethan with wide eyes, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. Ethan exhaled deeply, his shoulders dropping as relief washed over him. He hadn't allowed himself to believe he'd win until this very moment. And now that it was real, he felt a strange mix of emotions: joy, exhaustion, and an overwhelming sense of vindication. As reporters swarmed around him outside the courthouse, microphones thrust toward his face, Ethan found himself bombarded with questions. "How did you learn so much about law?" one asked. "Do you plan to become a lawyer officially?" Another pressed. Cameras flashed, capturing every expression, every word. At first, Ethan hesitated, unsure how much to share. But then he realized this was an opportunity, not just for him, but for others like him. Teenagers who felt powerless, people who thought the system couldn't be challenged. "I learned because I had to," he said finally, his voice calm but resolute. "My dad was a lawyer, and after he passed away, I wanted to keep his legacy alive. I started reading his books, studying cases, and eventually I realized I could use what I'd learned to help people." His words struck a chord. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail, while passers-by stopped to listen. Ethan spoke passionately about the flaws he'd seen in the justice system, how easily assumptions could overshadow facts, how bias could shape outcomes. "This isn't about me being smart or special," he added humbly. "It's about fairness. Everyone deserves a fair chance, no matter who they are or where they come from." Inside the courthouse, Judge Hensley sat alone in her chambers, staring at the empty bench where Ethan had stood just moments ago. She replayed the trial in her mind, the way he dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece, the quiet confidence in his voice when he revealed his secret. It wasn't just his legal knowledge that impressed her. It was his integrity, his unwavering belief in doing the right thing. But there was also guilt. Guilt for mocking him, for dismissing him as just another troublemaker. She pulled out a pen and began drafting a letter to the Judicial Oversight Committee, advocating for reforms in how young defendants were treated in court. "If we can underestimate someone like Ethan Carter," she wrote, "then we're failing our duty to uphold justice." Meanwhile, the prosecutor trudged back to his office, defeated but reflective. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stared out the window, replaying the trial in his mind. Ethan's poise, his command of the law, it wasn't something you saw every day. Maybe he'd underestimated the kid. Maybe he'd relied too heavily on stereotypes. Whatever the reason, one thing was clear. Ethan had taught him a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. Back outside, the crowd around Ethan showed no signs of dispersing. A group of teenagers approached him, their faces filled with admiration. "You're like a superhero," one of them said shyly. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "No, I'm just a regular guy who cared enough to try," he replied. "And if I can do it, so can you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the steps of the courthouse, Ethan took a moment to breathe it all in. He knew this victory wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The world had seen what he was capable of. And now, he had a platform to make a difference. Whether it was helping others navigate the legal system or pushing for change within it, Ethan was ready. Because for him, this wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about proving that anyone, no matter their age or background, could stand up for what was right and win. In the weeks following the trial, Ethan's story became a national sensation. News outlets couldn't get enough of the teenage legal prodigy who had outsmarted seasoned professionals and exposed flaws in the justice system. His face appeared on morning talk shows, his name trended on social media, and newspapers ran headlines like "The Boy Who Beat the System" and "Justice Served by a Hoodie-Wearing Genius." People were captivated, not just by his legal prowess, but by his humility and determination to fight for fairness. Despite the sudden fame, Ethan remained grounded. He declined lucrative offers from law firms eager to capitalize on his notoriety and turned down invitations to appear on flashy reality TV shows. Instead, he focused on using his newfound platform to advocate for juvenile justice reform. He partnered with nonprofit organizations that supported young people caught in the legal system, offering free workshops and resources to help them understand their rights. "I don't want anyone else to feel as alone as I did," he told a reporter during one interview. "If I can make even a small difference, it'll be worth it." Judge Hensley also underwent a transformation of her own. Initially criticized by some members of the legal community for her dismissive attitude toward Ethan, she used the backlash as an opportunity to grow. She invited him to speak at a judicial conference about bias in the courtroom, acknowledging her initial mistakes publicly. "We all have blind spots," she admitted during her introduction, "but recognizing them and learning from them is what makes us better judges, better lawyers, and better human beings." Ethan's speech at the conference was met with standing ovations. He spoke candidly about his experiences, emphasizing the importance of treating every defendant with dignity, regardless of age or appearance. "Justice isn't about winning or losing," he said. "It's about truth. It's about fairness. And it's about giving everyone, no matter who they are, a fair shot." His words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom approached him afterward to thank him for opening their eyes. Meanwhile, the prosecutor involved in the case quietly reevaluated his approach to trials. He began attending seminars on implicit bias and worked harder to ensure his cases were built on solid evidence rather than assumptions. Though he never directly apologized to Ethan, he sent a letter expressing gratitude for the lessons he learned. "You reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place," he wrote. "To seek justice, not convictions." As for the town where it all began, attitudes slowly shifted. City Hall removed the graffiti, replacing it with a mural designed by local students, a symbol of hope and change inspired by Ethan's story. The once dismissive residents now spoke proudly of the teenager who had put their sleepy little town on the map. Some even organized community events to discuss ways to support youth engagement and education, ensuring that future generations wouldn't face the same barriers Ethan had. Ethan continued balancing his advocacy work with school, earning top grades while mentoring younger students interested in law. His teachers marveled at his ability to juggle so much responsibility without losing sight of his goals. "He's extraordinary," one of them remarked during a parent-teacher meeting. "Not because of what he's accomplished, but because of how he carries himself, with kindness and purpose." By the time his high school graduation rolled around, Ethan had become a household name. As he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, the crowd erupted into applause, cheering louder than they had for any other graduate. But Ethan didn't let the attention go to his head. In his valedictorian speech, he thanked everyone who had supported him and urged his classmates to use their talents to make the world a better place. "We're the ones who will shape the future," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "Let's make sure it's a future we can all be proud of." Though Ethan still had years before he could officially join the bar, his journey was far from over. He had already made an impact that extended far beyond the courtroom, and there was no telling how much further he would go. One thing was certain: wherever life took him next, Ethan Carter would continue fighting for justice, inspiring others along the way. Months turned into years, and Ethan Carter's name remained synonymous with resilience, intelligence, and a relentless pursuit of justice. Though he was still too young to officially practice law, his influence stretched far beyond the confines of a courtroom. He became a symbol of hope for marginalized communities, especially teenagers who felt voiceless in a system that often overlooked them. His story inspired countless young people to believe in their potential, proving that age and circumstance didn't have to define what someone could achieve. Ethan continued his work with nonprofit organizations, traveling across the country to speak at schools, community centers, and legal conferences. He shared his experiences openly, encouraging others to question assumptions and challenge injustices they encountered. "Change starts with asking the right questions," he often said during these talks. "Don't accept things as they are if you know they can be better." His words resonated deeply, sparking conversations about reform in juvenile justice, education, and access to legal resources for underprivileged groups. Back in his hometown, the impact of Ethan's trial lingered long after the headlines faded. The mural on City Hall became a landmark, visited by locals and tourists alike. It served as a reminder not only of the vandalism case, but also of how one person's courage could inspire an entire community to rethink its values. A local youth center even named a new program after him, the Ethan Carter Advocacy Initiative. which provided free legal workshops and mentorship opportunities for teens interested in law or activism. Judge Margaret Hensley, once skeptical and dismissive, emerged as one of Ethan's strongest allies. She championed efforts to create more inclusive courtrooms, pushing for training programs that addressed implicit bias and encouraged judges to approach every case with empathy and fairness. At a national judicial summit, she introduced Ethan as her greatest teacher, crediting him with reminding her why she entered the legal profession in the first place. Their unlikely friendship became a testament to the power of growth and humility, showing that even those in positions of authority could learn from those they underestimated. As for the prosecutor, he quietly reinvented his career, focusing on cases that prioritize rehabilitation over punishment. He implemented stricter protocols within his office to prevent similar oversights, ensuring that evidence was thoroughly vetted before proceeding to trial. Though he rarely spoke publicly about Ethan, colleagues noticed a shift in his demeanor, a newfound commitment to fairness and integrity that hadn't been there before. By the time Ethan turned 21, he had already accomplished more than most people did in a lifetime. Yet he remained humble, always deflecting praise onto the mentors, friends, and family who supported him along the way. On his birthday, he received hundreds of messages from strangers whose lives he had touched. Teenagers inspired to pursue careers in law, families grateful for his advocacy work, and educators using his story to motivate their students. Each message reinforced his belief that individual actions could ripple outward, creating waves of positive change. When Ethan finally enrolled in law school, it wasn't just a personal milestone. It was a celebration for everyone who had followed his journey. Reporters flocked to cover his first day, capturing photos of him walking onto campus with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a determined smile on his face. For Ethan, this was just the next chapter, a chance to deepen his knowledge and expand his reach. But he never forgot where he came from or the lessons he'd learned along the way. Years later, when Judge Hensley retired, she kept a framed newspaper clipping of Ethan's graduation speech on her desk. Beneath it, she had written a simple note: "Justice begins with listening." It was a mantra she carried with her throughout her career, inspired by the teenager who had taught her to see beyond appearances. And though their paths rarely crossed again, both Ethan and Judge Hensley carried the lessons of that fateful trial with them forever. For Ethan, it was a reminder of the importance of perseverance and staying true to oneself. For Judge Hensley, it was a lesson in humility and the transformative power of second chances. Together, they had proven that justice wasn't just about verdicts. It was about understanding, growth, and the courage to do what was right, no matter the odds. In the end, Ethan's story became more than just a tale of triumph against adversity. It was a beacon of hope, a call to action, and a reminder that even the smallest voices could spark monumental change. And as he looked toward the future, Ethan knew one thing for certain: the fight for justice was far from over, but he was ready.